welcome. And it's an honor to be here today to talk to you about the control center of your health, the microbiome. There are no potential conflicts of interest relevant to this presentation, and slides that I'm presenting are my own and those modified and referenced from various experts. The content of this presentation is being made available for informational and educational purposes only. This content is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. I encourage you to always work with your qualified healthcare practitioner when making changes to your medication, diet, or overall health plan. The outline of this presentation is on this slide. We're going to review initially the background behind what the microbiome is, terminology and definitions. We'll review some foundational principles, harm or what can harm your balanced functional core microbiome, and how to weed out those things that are harmful so you can allow a bountiful harvest, which we'll be discussing in May. And we'll also briefly touch on preparing for May by reviewing briefly what it takes to seed and feed a healthy microbiome. I'm hopeful that communicating some basic principles to you and interventions will help you add years to your life and life to your years. Well, first, background. Well, this is your microbiome. Now, these aren't Skittles, but this is indeed the microbiome that can be found in the colon. This is actually a slide from the Sonnenberg's lab, Erica and Justin's lab at Stanford. They entered this into a Nikon contest several years ago, came in second. The first place was a bee harvesting pollen. This blue stuff down here are the colonocytes, and indeed, you're divided by the world by one layer of cells, these enterocytes that are about half the diameter of your hair. Guess what this is? Well, this is the mucus that divides the microbes from you. And in the colon, there's two layers. There's this outer layer and a more sterile inner layer. And it's been said, fences make good neighbors. Now, if we go to PubMed and enter in the term microbiome as of February the 5th of this year, you can see that there's over 110,000 results. And thus, there's a mountain of data concerning this subject now. It's the center of our bioscience endeavor. And at best, we'll just fly over the mountain peaks during this discussion. Well, the start to really understanding the microbiome was established in 2007 using culture-independent methods. These were methods that were used during the Human Genome Project that preceded this project. These culture-independent methods were used to characterize the microbial community within us, realizing that if we try to simply do conventional cultures of these microbes, at best, we may be only culturing up to 5 to 15%. And it takes these culture-independent methods to really identify what is in us. The goal was to characterize the microbes that inhabit the human body and examine whether changes in the microbiome can be related to health and disease. And this started what has been referred to as the omics revolution. The omic is a suffix that is applied to different technologies and methods of studying the microbiome and answering the following questions. Which microbes are there? What are the microbes doing? What is the genetic potential of these microbes? The normal microbiome, now as we understand, consists of bacteria, and there's three main categories. There's a dominant category. There's a non-dominant but keystone category. And in May, we're going to focus on some of these keystone organisms like Akkermansia muciniphila and how important that is. for maintaining our gut integrity and responding to certain types of chemotherapy. There's an ancient form of the third group I should add are the opportunistic pathogens. There's an ancient group of bacteria that are unicellular called archaea. When this overgrows in our small intestine, it produces methane and constipation. There's fungi. In fact, any given individual may be carrying up to 60 fungi at any point in time, and then the so-called protists. The composition of the microbiota varies with each individual. Most are fairly stable over the lifetime, but as we'll be seeing, certain perturbations can lead to significant changes in some of the keystone organisms. Some of the species, like through probiotics, can be transient. Each individual has a unique microbial fingerprint. And throughout the body, there's these unique ecosystems that are complex. So there's been a changing face of microbes and a paradigm shift from looking at microbes as being killer germs to looking at microbes as our fellow travelers and a part of our inner ecosystem. Well, let's look briefly at some terminology and definitions. Microbiota is now the term used. Instead of microflora, we refer to the microbes as our microbiota, the community of commensal, symbiotic, and pathogenic microorganisms that share our body space. The microbiome then is the total number of microorganisms and their genetic material. The microbiome consists of bacteria, referred to as the bacteriome. There is a virome, and that's the viral community that is in us. And it's been estimated we probably at any point carry about 1 quadrillion viruses, 10 times more than we carry bacteria. And these are especially so-called bacteriophages that actually are kind of like shepherds to the bacteria. They infect the bacteria and play some role in creating and maintaining a balance which we're yet to fully discover. Microbiome is the fungal community. In addition, there is the holobiome, which is the sum total of the host and microbiota genomes. And then there's the xenobiome, which is all the microbiota and their genomes in our environment, everything that surrounds us. An ecosystem includes all the living organisms in an area, from plants and animals to microorganisms, and within our bodies, it's primarily then the bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protists. And it also has to take into consideration the physical environment, which in May will come back and focus on much more closely. The terroir, or the terrain, in other words, that can maintain a balanced microbiome. It's like your internal garden, that if the soil isn't enriched, the plants don't thrive. Perturbations can come along, a disturbance in a microbial ecosystem. And then finally, the key term that we're going to be centering our discussion around today, when you lose a balanced, healthy, functional core microbiome, it is referred to as dysbiosis, a microbial imbalance on or inside the body. Most commonly reported as a condition in the digestive tract or an imbalance in your gut bacteria. This may reflect change in composition. You may have decreased, especially keystone organisms, or you may have increase in the opportunistic pathogens. It may also reflect the distribution, that the bacteria that are primarily in your colon can translocate into the small intestine and then lead to what's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that is a state of dysbiosis. Well, let's look at some functional principles that have been developed since 2007, since the Human Microbiome Project was initiated. Well, what was learned and published in 2012 was that the body consists of multiple unique ecosystems, diverse and complex. It can be mapped out scientifically as shown here in terms of each area, the mouth, nose, skin, urogenital, gastrointestinal, each having its own unique ecosystem consisting of unique bacteria and so on. It can be likened to our planet Earth. The oral microbiome can be likened to a coral reef that is thriving. And the skin is more like the plains of western Nebraska. And then finally, the gastrointestinal tract microbiome and its ecosystem can be likened to an Amazon tropical forest. Each person has an estimated 1,000, even up to 1,500 bacterial species now, with over 2 million bacterial genes. The total pool of estimated bacteria now is exceeding 10,000 species and exceeding 8 million genes. Unlike our human genome, these genes are malleable. It's important to always take into consideration so-called regional growth conditions. Any little change, such as in the pH, temperature, oxygen tension, and so on, can profoundly impact the microbiome. Think of a thriving ecosystem. Here, a coral reef, as shown here, and then a change in temperature by several degrees will lead to a blanching of that coral reef. That increased temperature, with or without toxins, will drive the algae out of that coral plant. Now, the coral plant's still alive, but as you can see, it's not a very healthy coral plant. Well, the ecosystems are dynamic and have a stable ecosystem with two properties. First, resistance, the ability to resist change triggered by a disturbance. Resilience, the ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbances and still retain its basic function and structure. As you can see here over our lifetime, disturbances, perturbances, mediators, perpetuators that can be affecting and disturbing our microbiome can lead to what's called dysbiosis again, and decreased health and chronic medical conditions. So humans are a walking ecosystem, in fact, multiple ecosystems. And these are complex and diverse. We harbor trillions of microbes, 100 times more microbial genes than human genes. And again, these can be malleable. I like these two slides from Rob Knight, who is the head of what's called the American Gut Project, which we'll come back and briefly touch on. But it's now estimated we have 30 trillion human cells and 39 trillion microbial cells. And as we'll learn, is 38 of those 39 are actually in our colon. So we're only 43% human by cell count. Now, if we take into consideration those genes, and the human has around 20,000 genes that are protein or coding for proteins that we learned from the Human Genome Project, but we carry anywhere from 2 to 20 million microbial genes. So thus, by gene count, we're only about 1% human, and it's hard to maintain health when you ignore 99% of your biologic system. So briefly, if we look at the normal colonic microbiota, we see again 38 trillion of the bacteria are living there, 500 to about 1,500 different species in a given individual. 60% of your stool volume is actually bacteria. So when you have a bowel movement, you're actually more human. They assist in digestion of non-digestible fiber. They produce vitamins, normally protects us against invasive pathogens. It maintains our colon health through production of free fatty acids, such as butyric acid. It controls our metabolism, immune system, and CNS. And we're going from more correlation now to really finding out there's true causation, that there's molecules being released by the bacteria that can be drivers and perpetuators of chronic disease, including and starting with heart disease and cancer and autoimmune disease and so on. Well, if we put this in context, then that we have these environmental factors that can be mediators of disruption of our microbiome, or perpetuators or triggers, if you will. This includes toxins, unhealthy lifestyle habits, including diet, stress, inadequate sleep, inadequate movement, being a slough, And this interacts now with our genes in a whole new science called epigenetics, where we have learned that even though our structural genes are relatively fixed, that they're programmed so they can be upregulated or downregulated. It's like a light switch. They can be turned on or off. And this interacts then with our microbiome. The microbiome can be affected by the environment. The microbiome can in turn affect the environment, including the lining of the gut. It can interact with our genes and can upregulate or downregulate certain genes, especially inflammatory genes, by the molecules or metabolites that are being released. It's been said, though, that our genes can only affect our microbiome at a level of about 1.9%. And within the middle of all this, these interacting three circles on this Venn diagram is life. And surrounding all that is our consciousness and spirit, what goes beyond quantum physics. Over a lifetime, our microbiome can change. We now know that even in the womb, the baby is developing a microbiome at the time of birth. C-section versus vaginal delivery can have a significant impact on the microbiome. By the age of 3, the microbiome that we have is pretty well fixed, the core microbiome, but over a lifetime, there can be shifts throughout these 4 major phyla based on the environmental factors that we encounter. So each individual is unique and everything is connected and everything you do matters. And this is kind of the foundation to functional medicine, which we'll be coming back and discussing. The intestinal microbiota, we now controls what your weight is. If you have type 2 diabetes, do you have cardiovascular disease? Do you have the metabolic syndrome? It affects the immune system. It can lead to dysregulation of the immune system, as it can lead to dysregulation of the hormonal, neurologic systems. It is a contributor to the development of autoimmune diseases, and now we understand cancer, allergies, and asthma. It can affect are you anxious? Are you depressed? It appears to play a role in the autism spectrum disorder, and it plays a role in chronic neurologic conditions such as multiple sclerosis. The microbiota is like an unsupervised drug factory. If we look at the molecules circulating in your bloodstream, it's now estimated by the experts that up to 50% of those molecules circulating in your bloodstream are coming from your gut microbiome. And this can include DNA, RNA, proteins, or just simple molecules. And these are, again, upregulating, downregulating genes, and so on. So what can harm a balanced functional core microbiome? Well, I like this poster. This is the series out of Netflix, Lost in Space, and the robot here is declaring danger, danger, Will Robinson. Well, I would say danger, danger microbiome, because we're losing species. Species lost due to going back 3 or 4 generations. What was happening to our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on? We can now track our health back to 3 or 4 generations, it turns out. How you're delivered. Is it a vaginal delivery where you acquire the nice, normal mother vaginal microbiome, or do you acquire the microbiome from the healthcare workers that are surrounding you? Are you breastfed where you get prebiotics and postbiotics, or are you simply given nutrient-poor formula? Antibiotics, we know, have a profound effect, like a nuclear bomb sometimes, devastating our microbiome and leading to conditions such as Clostridioides difficile infection. We know that SAD, the standard American diet, although some would say this has really had the horrible American diet now, and stress all play a very important role in contributing to dysbiosis. We know other additives that we may consume through our foods, artificial sweeteners. One of the original studies showed sucralose devastated 50% of the microbiome in an animal model. And since then, we've documented additional artificial sweeteners like aspartame can also have a very profound effect on the microbiome, leading to dysbiosis. Emulsifying agents, we're just beginning to see some research in this area, and they can also have a significant disrupting effect something we don't think about a lot, but microplastics, like through salt, can be there. In fact, one recent study published that showed even fruits and vegetables can carry microplastics into your system. And it's estimated, the research is suggesting that the average American citizen is consuming about the equivalent of a credit card now of microplastics every week. Glyphosate-based herbicides and pesticides are just beginning to take front center, I think, although there's been a lot of emphasis, of course, on buying organic to get away from these GMO foods that were designed so you can spray glyphosates or glyphosate-based herbicides, pesticides like Roundup on the crops as they're growing. The problem with this, glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic in the 1970s. So not only does it kill the weeds, but it kills the bacteria in the soil. Thus, our soil is being robbed of the nutrient-producing bacteria. And it also has a very profound effect on our microbiome in the gut. Drinking water. We don't like to think about this, but several years ago, there was a study that showed one of the pollutants in the Omaha water was above the toxic level. We've heard about other problems around the country with heavy metals. And not to forget, but microplastics can be found even in our drinking water, reinforcing perhaps the importance of filtering your water. And then finally, certain medications such as the acid blockers, proton pump inhibitors, H2 blockers, can also have a profound effect, decreasing stomach acid, which is one of the initial defenses we have against especially pathogens that are trying to get into the rest of our gut. And it turns out a number of other medications they're starting to look at, such as metformin, causes an increasing amount of so-called proteobacteria, aka E. coli. Well, Jin and his colleagues kind of reviewed, as they titled it, effects of environmental pollutants on the gut microbiota, reinforcing how important our gut microbiota is for our health. And then our gut microbiota, as they presented in their review, are very sensitive to a number of drugs, like we reviewed, diet and so-called environmental pollutants, all leading to potential dysbiosis and having ill effects on our health. And thus they make this plea that we should be testing all medications and a number of foods potentially about the potential toxicity of our internal garden. Now, over a lifespan, this slide shows what has been happening, going from being born to a stable adult microbiota, but over a lifespan, more and more people are losing diversity, composition of keystone organisms, and developing gut dysbiosis centered around chronic perturbations and leading to so-called inflammaging and aging of the immune system, immunosenescence. Could this be centered around poor diet? Perhaps, and we'll come back and discuss that in further detail. Well, let's put this all together. What we're seeing, the so-called phenotype of the patients we see admitted in the hospital as an outpatient setting, multiple chronic conditions, of course, leading to multiple or polypharmacy, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, overweight, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, strokes, depression, autoimmunity, cancer, and cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's, and last but not least, increased risk of dying of certain infectious diseases. Core metabolic imbalances. It is now being hypothesized more and more that the core imbalance for many of these chronic conditions, and at least at a correlation level, and now increasingly at a causative level, is a microbiome dysbiosis, the release of molecules that again can be upregulating, downregulating certain genes that can then lead to chronic disease associated with a leaky gut or an increased intestinal permeability, chronic inflammation, dysfunction of our ancestral bacteria that are in our cells that are little powerhouses called mitochondria, leading to loss of energy, dysregulation or dysfunction of our immune, hormonal, and neural systems, and then chronic stress leading to oxidative stress. It's like our body is being rusted. And then the root causes, all these are those that can cause disturbances or perturbances of our microbiome. Stress, sad, or again, maybe had, being a slough, not getting restorative sleep, social isolation, all the environmental toxins, perhaps a spiritual emptiness, and finally, medications. Well, the Sonnenbergs at Stanford published this article back in 2014, Starving Our Microbial Self, the Deleterious Consequences of a Diet Deficient in MAX, not the ones you get at the Golden Arches, but microbiota accessible carbohydrates. And they go into how the gut microbiota is the control center for our human biology. And they've studied non-Western populations, Western populations, and the fiber intake. And as you can see, how much of a difference there is in terms of the number of phylotypes between Western and non-Western populations. And they have come up with this hypothesis. Scenario 1, traditional populations, increased MAC intake, increased microbiota diversity, increased metabolic output, protection from Western diseases. So the fiber they eat, broccoli and so on, can't be digested by our own small intestinal tract, but go on down into the colon and feed, in general, your friendly microbiota. Versus scenario 2 is industrialized Western populations, where 70% of our diet is highly ultra-processed foods, lacking nutrients, lacking fiber. We're down 150 grams up here, down to 5 to 15 grams. And what happens, these simple sugars, refined carbohydrates, are readily absorbed, get into our circulation, and look what we're doing. Our microbiome in the colon is being starved. And it turns out a starving microbiome will eat you, as shown initially in this mouse model. Fiber-rich diet, fiber-deficient diet, sticky buns, donuts, soda, ice cream. And here's what they showed in the lab. Fiber-rich, you can see the fiber here, maintaining that fence, that barrier, the mucous membrane, but eating donuts, soda, ice cream, no fiber. And the microbes are getting hungry, and then they start eating away at this mucus lining, the fence. And they have documented a bloom of mucus-degrading bacteria, emergence of opportunistic pathogens, and increased markers of inflammation. And as we now know, all chronic diseases are associated with low-grade chronic inflammation, and a growing hypothesis that this inflammation initially, many times, may be coming and triggered from the inflammation at the gut that's communicating with 70% of your immune system that is in the gastrointestinal tract, or the so-called GALT. Well, let's apply this. Does it happen in humans? Well, Tim Spector is in one of the books I've referenced to you, the Diet Myths. Tim had a son, Tom, who was a genetics student who'd really been eating a great diet, and his father challenged him to a McDonald's diet for 10 days. And McDonald's destroyed the gut bacteria of Tom. In only 10 days, he turned gray and ashen. And as the lab results returned, they were shocking. That Tim wrote that his son's gut bacteria were devastated. Over the 10 days, Tom lost nearly 1,400 types of bacteria species, or nearly 40% of his total variety. And Tim Spector noted that the loss of the gut bacteria diversity is a universal signal of ill health. So our gut ecosystem is losing diversity over a lifetime. High diversity, better health. Low diversity, chronic disease. Several papers here kind of reinforcing how low diversity of microbiota is associated with poor health, including all these chronic medical conditions with increased inflammation, diabetes, lipid disorders. And does that explain why, as these authors reported in the year 2009 to 2016, that only 12% of our US population had optimal metabolic health. And in fact, by the time you turn 60, that optimal health level was down to 2%. And that's looking at 5 variables: glucose intolerance, blood pressure, triglyceride level, HDL level, and your waist hip measurement. Well, so in summary, there's a number of factors affecting our gut microbiome, numerous perturbations leading to decreased resistance, resilience. Do we have a unifying hypothesis of what may be most important? Well, some feel it's centered around SAD, or again, this HAD, the horrible American diet that's centered around processed, nutrient-deficient foods that have changed now the world's diets. Refined and added sugars, refined white wheat flour, these high omega-6 industrialized seed oils, or so-called PUFAs, polyunsaturated oils. Vegetable is somewhat of a misnomer. These are not nutrient-dense foods. These are industrialized seed oils. The nutrients have been stripped out, and they're highly oxidative, pro-inflammatory, and as some are showing in the laboratory, very toxic. They produce toxins such as acrolein, so that one serving of McDonald's French fries, some suggest is like smoking 80 low acrolein cigarettes at one time. Artificially created trans fats as well. Some of my patients ask, well, you mean junk food? Yes, ultra-processed nutrient-poor foods. The shape of things to come, or are we already there? I like this cartoon. Wait a minute. Something feels very, very wrong. Well, what do we need to weed out for a bountiful harvest? Well, it's really all about risk versus benefit. The next few slides, I'm going to propose just some interventions you can do, again, to maybe add years to your life and life to your years, understanding that the microbiome is the center of your health. Either it's going to make you healthier or it may lead to chronic diseases. So first of all, I always instruct my patients, please, at least read the labels and perhaps not even buy foods with labels on them unless it says non-GMO or is leading you to buying healthy, whole foods, nutrient-dense foods. Try to avoid foods that have the following ingredients that your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. And that includes this carboxymethylcellulose, one recent study showing profound changes in the gut microbiome. Carrageenan, look at your toothpaste. Is there carrageenan in it? If it's Crest or Colgate, yeah, likely there could be. Artificial colors, natural flavors, all these contributing to dysbiosis. Caution in purchasing fast foods, and sadly to say caution in eating out. Some of the resources I find helpful in directing my patient to, there's a Dirty Dozen. It used to be a Dirty Dozen app, but it's being updated, but you can go in and print out the Environmental Working Group's Shopper's Guide to glyphosate based pesticides or herbicides. So you can buy, if in the Dirty Dozen, you want to be sure those are organic. There's a Clean 15 that don't necessarily need to be purchased organic. There's a Healthy Living app or this Think Dirty app that you should have downloaded that I'm using all the time to make sure any personal care object such as shampoo and toothpaste and so on is healthy and isn't loaded with toxins or pollutants. And the Environmental Working Group has food scores for about 80,000 different foods now, directing you towards what is healthier. Be careful with your salt. There's a growing body of science that you need to be cautious and get salt that's free of microplastics. And the only three that I've come across recently, there's Redmond, which is real salt out of Utah, Himalayan, which is out of Pakistan, and Celtic, which is out of France. And these are salts that are mined in deeper ancient reservoirs where microplastics haven't had a chance to get to them. But one word of caution, that even in the processing, sometimes microplastics can be introduced. And again, microplastics can be found in our water. So I advocate filtering your water, including Missouri River water, and then consider you've taken out all the minerals and electrolytes. Although with a good balanced diet, fruits and vegetables, you may get these back, but I always add a little additional minerals and electrolytes to my water. There's two filtering systems that are on the tabletop, Brita and AquaTrue. And actually I use the AquaTrue, and you can get a tube that reintroduces minerals and electrolytes in that device. This is an example of what you can find on the Environmental Working Group for the Dirty Dozen. You can see strawberries, apples, so on. Some of the lifestyle changes that diminish dysbiosis, managing stress, getting restorative sleep, social connection. As it's been shown that if you can hug in a politically correct way, 7 times or more a day, your loved one, you can actually decrease respiratory infection by 35%. And I think your microbes are probably listening to that as well. Movement's important, changing dietary habits, diminishing sugar and ultra-processed, refined, carbohydrate-dense foods. And I tell my patients, just dim down. You can't all of a sudden take all these things out, but just dim it down. Get down to that 6 teaspoons a day of added sugar that the World Health Organization recommends. Whenever possible, go organic. Avoid those glyphosate-based or the foods that have had glyphosate exposure. Eliminate industrialized processed seed oils. The misnomer, again, vegetable oils. These include soy, corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, peanut, grapeseed, rice bran, and even be cautious about extra virgin olive oil or avocado oil because many of these are adulterated. For example, they throw in canola oil. In general, avoid feedlot meats, poultry, and eggs that have antibiotics in the meat because they were given to the animal. And then avoid artificial sweeteners as much as you can. Dim that down. Emulsifiers, thickeners. I can remember one patient who came in was drinking 10 Diet Pepsis every day, profound fatigue, brain fog. And one intervention, I said, maybe this is the trigger to your problems. He came back a month later, had cold turkey Diet Pepsi, back to normal. Discharged. Additional interventions, use antibiotics judiciously. If possible, taper, DC, the acid blockers. Consider testing, diagnosis, and treatment of those conditions associated with dysbiosis, starting with the mouth, the periodontitis, see your dentist regularly. In the stomach, Helicobacter pylori, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. A new term, intestinal methanogenic overgrowth. Those archaea overgrowing your small bowel, leading to constipation. And then you can see small intestinal fungal overgrowth as well. And then sometimes having to test for enteric pathogens. You may want to discover your gut microbiome. American Gut Project, which has actually been closed down for now to do COVID research. Join Zoe. I've had a handful of patients use Join Zoe and perhaps even more joining Viome. And these two latter ones use artificial intelligence in terms of telling you and guiding you, do you have friendly bacteria or unhealthy bacteria? Do you have leaky gut and so on? Join Zoe simplifies it down. Do you have the 15 healthy bacteria? Do you have the 15 bad guys? One recent patient, she had none of the 15 healthy, but all the 15 bad guys, as you will. Tests for metabolic dysfunction. These are some of the tests that your primary care physician may not be doing, but hemoglobin A1C reflecting your blood sugar level over the last 90 days, more and more people are emphasizing maybe getting a continuous glucose monitor. I think fasting insulin reflects insulin resistance. According to Benjamin Bickman, that's the cause of all these chronic diseases, but I think it's more complicated than that. Then Omega Quant will tell you where you're at with your lipid intake. Are you getting enough healthy omega-3 fatty acids? More recently, I've had my patients start wearing these devices more and more that track their health, an Apple Watch, Fitbit, the Garmin, or an Oura Ring. And I have found that very useful. My patients come in, medically unexplained symptoms. I see they're under a lot of stress. And I tell them, well, use your Apple Watch, get an Oura Ring, and come back in 4 weeks and chart out your heart rate variability, because heart rate variability really reflects the balance of your autonomic nervous system. And I had one patient who was under extreme stress, psychosocial stressors and everything, didn't understand why she was having this brain fog. And 4 weeks later, she came back using her Oura Ring and said, I couldn't believe it. My heart rate variability stayed in the teens the whole time, 24/7, which reflected she was always in the sympathetic mode, in the fight and flight mode. She could not rest and relax. Versus a higher heart rate variability. You can look up this online, like in the Wobble website, but heart rate variability is age dependent, but often it's in the range of 40 to 60. And if you can't bounce back and you're always staying in that sympathetic mode, your microbiome in time listens to that, high cortisol levels and so on. And that is a very important factor, I think, in leading the dysbiosis. So we have to work with our patients on learning to rest and relax so they can digest. I mentioned the American Gut Project that has been closed down, but where you donate $100 and it will tell you where you're on at this microbiome map. Well, briefly then, preparing for seeding and feeding. This area I really refer to as therapeutic microbiology. It's the emerging subspecialty of our infectious disease specialty. We've gone over weeding today. Next session in May, we're going to get into more seeding and feeding. We're going to be talking about what Alessio Fasano, who is a pediatric gastroenterologist who's really a guru behind celiac disease, has published this paper. And one of the books I refer you to, All Disease Begins in the Leaky Gut. And he goes through the role of zonulin, which is that hormone that is released under various conditions to open up those tight junctions that normally are there to prevent things getting in that then can lead to food sensitivity and activation of our immune system, and chronic inflammation and chronic disease, can lead to autoimmune disease. Again, 70% of our immune system is here. Here's the book by Alessio, Gut Feelings. I should warn you, though, this is an encyclopedia, but it's a good reference book. If you have certain conditions, you can look up what we now understand about the science behind how leaky gut, how dysbiosis may be contributing to your chronic disease. Next time, we're going to be going over the 5 R's of functional medicine. The Institute of Functional Medicine developed these, which I also apply to patient care, starting with removing the toxins, weeding out, if you will. And this now also includes how we can restore a healthy gut lining, the terrain, the terroir, if you will. We'll talk about replacing, repopulating, repairing, and then rebalancing. And how do you arrive at a personalized functional diet? In fact, the NIH now is providing millions of dollars in grants over the next 10 years to be able to research what do we mean by a personalized diet. And I would throw in personalized functional diet, which I think then leads to a functional core microbiome to keep you healthy. The Sonnenberg's book, which is a must to at least read or listen to while you're driving around, The Good Gut by Justin and Erica. Again, Tim Spector's book, The Diet Myth. And then I think this book is worth reading. Robert Lustig is a pediatric neuroendocrinologist. His TED Talk back in 2009 entitled Sugar, The Bitter Truth has been listened or been watched by, I think, over 13 million people now. And in this book, the most updated book he's published, entitled Metabolical, The Truth About Processed Food and How It Poisons People and the Planet. So all disease begins in the gut, and our food should be our medicine, and our medicine should be our food, the gateway to health. Well, thank you.
Dr. Penn, does taking probiotics minimize some of the negative effects of the American lifestyle, like poor diet, poor sleep, things that you've already mentioned, our microbiome? So taking probiotics minimize some of the negative things we do.
That's a good question, Rachel. I'm frequently asked numbers of questions as I'm rounding about health and lifestyle and probiotics. And if we look at the research and our understanding, probiotics can usually very transient. Many are derived from food. Some are human derived, such as cholesterol, for example. But one recent study out of Stanford, which we'll be reviewing in May, and some additional studies suggest that if you don't have fertile soil, you don't have the microbiome, the probiotics just pass right through you. So you need to have the right microbiome for those probiotics to work. And again, we'll be going through this further in May, but it gets in the area of therapeutic microbiology. We selectively use probiotics for some patients who may have lactobacillus or a bifidobacterium. There's actually a probiotic with Akkermansia mucinophilia now that helps control diabetes, as it turns out. So we're getting closer, I think, to some therapeutic microbiology, but by and large, we don't advocate a lot of probiotic use. If you're on antibiotics, yes, and then maybe selectively, case by case, I'll use a probiotic or suggest a probiotic to a patient.
Follow up to that, someone was asking about how do you know which probiotics to go with? I mean, there's a million choices for everything nowadays, right? So what would you recommend?
Well, personally, what I do, and I direct my patients to a kind of a expert site called consumerlabs.com and look up the probiotics, and they have exhaustive reviews on all the supplements that you would even want to consider taking, but also on probiotics, and look up, they provide you the science. So if you've got a certain condition, go to consumerlabs.com. You can join up for a year. It's relatively inexpensive. So I would recommend they go to that. And then on a given patient, I will go to that and review with them maybe which probiotic might be helpful.
But there was a question that came in about dried fruit. Is dried fruit bad for you?
It's an interesting question. And like so many things, it's a processed food. So it depends on what else is in the dried fruit or what else has been used to dry it, to process it, and to preserve it in the package, presumably, in which you've purchased it. So we know in some cases there are sulfites. And again, it would depend. If you dried it yourself in your own home dehydrator yesterday and you're eating it today, that might be a very nutritious, nutrient-dense food and very convenient and a very excellent substitute for what you used to use as your snack food. On the other hand, if you've bought a packaged product that has been preserved and there's chemical preservatives on it, then those chemicals could affect your microbiome in a negative way. And again, the answer so often with nutrition is it depends. So it's an excellent question, but if I was your physician, I would ask you, tell me a little bit more about the kinds of dry fruit you're talking about, and tell me how you would be eating it, when you would be eating it, and what would you be eating this instead of? So those are all relevant considerations. What do you think, Dr. Penn?
Yes, I agree, Dr. Luby. It depends.
I think it depends is a great way to approach every question. Gather some details and say, well, it depends. We do have another question about more of an explanation for Dr. Penn to expand a little bit more on PPIs, acid reducers, and how do they harm the microbiome?
Well, you have to look at the digestive system. You know, when it comes to eating, I always tell patients 4 things. How you eat, you got to relax. If you don't relax and you're in the sympathetic nervous system, you're not going to be able to digest. It messes up things downstream, including acid production in the stomach and your enzymes. So digestion begins in the mouth with saliva and the enzymes there, but the stomach plays a very important role in initially digesting protein with acid. And then if you lose that acid barrier, there's bacteria, as with probiotics, can be inactivated by stomach acid, but that acid barrier, if it's not there, you're much more likely to get these so-called opportunistic pathogens passing through into the bowel. You get Salmonella, Shigella, and so on. But also we now know there is an impact on the downstream effects of the small bowel. There's something about losing stomach acid and increasing risk of overgrowth of bacteria, fungi, and archaea in the more distal small bowel. So stomach acid is not only there for digestion, but it's there as a defense barrier.
Thank you. All right, another question, Dr. Luby, this is for you. So carbs get a bad rap. It's not all carbs we need to avoid. Our bodies need complex carbs like fruits, veggies, things like that. How do you help explain this to patients that have it ingrained, like either to count carbs or limit carbs?
Right. The simple way that I like to explain this to my patient is carbohydrates can come from fruits, from vegetables, from grains, wheat, rice, oats, things like that. The most commonly processed carbohydrates come from those grains. So when you turn a grain into flour, that's a very processed product. Often it's added to products with sugar or fat, of course, too. But processed grains tend to be the simplest form of carbs other than pure sugars and things. So you want to limit the amount of flour-based products that you have in processed grains. When it comes to plants, this is how I like to explain it to my patients. what is that part of the plant doing for the plant? Think about the parts of the plant that are below the ground, above the ground, and protecting the seeds. The parts that are below the ground are storing energy in a quick form to be used by the parts of the plant that are above the ground. So root vegetables will have a lot of starches and pretty ready to use energy and carbohydrates. So that's a simpler form of carbohydrate than the one I'll mention above the ground. If you think about the flesh around a seed, whether it's a tomato or an orange or what have you, that's nutrient for the seed to develop once it starts to grow. So that's readily available carbohydrate as well, which tends to be somewhat simpler. Now, the carbohydrates in roots and around seeds are not as simple as those in grains, especially when they're processed. But in general, carbohydrate that comes from fruit is not the most complex form of carbohydrate. If the part of the plant that you're eating had to support the plant and resist gravity and reach toward the sun and capture sunlight or be a landing pad for insects to get pollen, then it's a complex carbohydrate. That's the best form of carbohydrate to eat. So here we're talking about stems and leaves and flowers. So if you think of celery and asparagus and all the leafy greens and broccoli and Brussels sprouts are really basically forms of flowers. So the most complex form of carbohydrate, stems, leaves, and flowers, the parts of the plant that grow above the ground but are not protecting the seed. So that's how I like to explain it.
That is wonderful. I like visuals, so thank you. I've never heard that before, so I'm going to apply that. I appreciate it. We had a very interesting question about, and Dr. Penn, you can take this one, about, so those babies that are born via C-section, that's part one, and also those babies that need antibiotic therapies. And you think about the babies that maybe had to start off in the NICU and things like that. How can we help replace and hopefully help their microbiome since they started off kind of at a disadvantage, it sounds like?
Well, that's an excellent question, Rachel, because if we realize what happens at birth can have a profound effect on us throughout our lifetime, it becomes important, especially to get a healthy microbiome established by 3 years of age. And if you're not going to get it at the time of birth, you may never get it. So what has been proposed, and there's researchers out there, I talked to this on and off with our obstetricians. I don't think anybody's doing it, but some suggest that if you got to deliver by C-section, you then insert a tampon in the mother's vaginal area, and then at the time that's it, as they're being delivered, and then you take that tampon and spread it over the baby. Now that sounds like a yuck factor, but that has been shown to help reestablish a healthier microbiome. So that would be number one, that we think we really need to be looking at that more closely with our obstetricians and the research and where we're at with that. If there's anybody online that wants to take that on as a project, let me know. Number two, of course, when you're on antibiotics, you disturb your microbiome. So taking a probiotic at that point in time might be helpful, or as we can come back and talk more about fermented foods. If the child is at an age where they can have fermented foods, maybe a much more beneficial way. One study a year or two ago showed that antibiotics and then probiotic, and then if you continue the probiotic, it actually delayed your microbiome bouncing back, versus if you got a fecal microbiome transplant, of course, it helped right away. But if you stop the probiotic, your microbiome actually bounce back quicker. So be selective using the probiotic, but certainly there are probiotics that might be of value if you have to be on an antibiotic.
Thank you for that. And I have heard that before. So I know it does sound, like you said, a little bit yuck, but yes, I have heard that. And parents are willing to do lots for their kids. So I don't think that you would get much pushback from a parent, honestly. You did mention fermented foods. So we have a question about fermented foods. The fermented foods increase microbiome diversity. How do you recommend introducing these types of food into someone's diet?
I would love to answer that question. I love this
You
question.
can have it.
Okay.
Okay. Fermented foods are ancient practice. And what happens with fermented foods is that you basically let a food sit and I don't want to say rot, but for a couple of weeks usually, to the point where beneficial bacteria are digesting it and increasing the nutrient density of the food. They're actually reducing the simple carbohydrates and increasing other nutrients, sometimes including vitamins. And they can actually increase the protein content, the relative protein content of the food in terms of the protein to carbohydrate ratio. And you're getting live bacteria, which are good for your microbiota when you eat these fermented foods. Probably the one you're most familiar with would be sauerkraut or maybe kimchi. Now, a great way to introduce those is to mix them in with another vegetable or a salad. If you don't think you'd like sauerkraut or kimchi, just put a little bit into a salad and then it kind of drowns it out at first. A great way to get introduced to this. Now, another wonderful fermented food is miso, which is traditionally made from soybeans, but if you have trouble with soy, you can get it from chickpeas or other legumes. And a great way to do this is at the end of a stir fry, or if you've steamed some vegetables lightly, take that spoonful of miso and stir it around in there. You don't want to boil it and heat it so that you kill the microbes, but if you put it in at the very end and stir it around, it provides that wonderful umami flavor. It's salty, and when you combine it with an olive oil or butter or some kind of oil, it makes a stir fry just delicious. And people will ask you, oh, what's the seasoning you've put in that? And it can just be miso. So that's a way that I love to introduce miso. You can mix miso into all kinds of other things again, right at the end of when you cook it. But with miso on vegetables, just consider it as another spice. So that's how I like to introduce it in a way that doesn't overpower people at first. You can dilute them with other foods at first. Dr. Penn, do you have any other tips on fermented food introduction?
Well, like you've implied, Dr. Luby, go low and slow.
I like both of those suggestions because maybe some in the audience are thinking, don't know if I could just go out and eat some fermented food, but I definitely will try something. And thank you for those suggestions and reminding people that it is possible. Go slow and decide what you like, because there's many of options out there.
Rachel, if I may, I'll disclose one of Shea Luby's recipes. A salad dressing with miso is wonderful. And what I like to do is equal parts Dijon mustard and miso, your favorite oil and vinegar, ginger. That makes the most delectable salad dressing. And you can put that on your salad that you've diluted with a little bit of sauerkraut or kimchi, and you've got a delicious, full of probiotics, really good for your microbiota salad there. But salad dressing with miso, that's a great way to introduce fermented foods.
Fantastic. Thank you. I wrote that down so that way I can remember that. I actually honestly had to Google miso because I didn't even know what form it looked like. So more research for me to do on that.
M-I-S-O for anybody who's wondering, M-I-S-O.
And someone said, who's hungry? Me. Me as well. It is lunchtime. We do have a follow-up question about, and Dr. Penn, Dr. Luby, you can talk about it too, but Dr. Penn, you were talking about with C-sections and that gut microbia, they're starting off with a C-section, not first choice, but sometimes that's just how we have a healthy mom, healthy baby. So what about if they go from a C-section and then they're breastfed? Is that going to kind of help offset some of the negative effects of that altered microbiome, I should say?
Well, certainly, if you haven't done any of those other interventions we mentioned, that breastfeeding certainly is going to help. It's going to give you a bifidobacterium infantis. It's going to give you oligosaccharides that only that bifidobacterium can digest. And all that translates into a healthier baby brain, as it turns out. If it can totally overcome that initial colonization, it at least is going to help. I'm not sure you can totally override it, though.
I think we need more research on that. But it is true that breast milk has been found to be not sterile, meaning it does have bacteria. I like to say that breast milk is also for the baby and the baby's nutrition. But what is breast milk for? Breast milk is for the immune system. There are components there that will help the baby's immune system, for sure. There are nutrients in breast milk that humans cannot digest. And those nutrients are actually for the bacteria in the intestine. And, Mother Nature has designed it in such a way that human women have developed that they produce nutrients in the breast milk which are not for humans, they're for the microbiome. That's how important these bacteria are that Dr. Penn was talking about. And finally, Dr. Penn mentioned the importance of being calm when you eat, meal hygiene and such. The effect of the nervous system when we're eating and digesting and absorbing our food is very important. And the other thing that's important about breastfeeding is the skin-to-skin touch, the human interaction, the focus of the mother on the baby. They've compared breastfeeding on the breast versus breast milk from a bottle, and they've compared the response of the baby in many ways, heart rate variability and other things. It's almost certain that there is more nutrient absorption and digestion when the baby is feeding from the breast than even from a bottle with breast milk, and certainly from a bottle with formula. So breastfeeding important for so many reasons, not just for human nutrition.
Thank you. All right, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So one, and I'll let either one of you decide who wants to take it, but it's kind of a general question. So it seems like everyone's tired, has no energy. We blame it on our hectic lifestyle, which could be partially true, but I read energy starts in your gut and influences energy produced and how energy is spent. Is it true?
Who goes first, Dr. Penn?
Go ahead, Dr. Luby.
Energy. Food is energy. Food is calories. So we need that right there. So factors that improve the energy outcome of your meals. Let's think of it that way. What is it about meals that will give you the most energy? Well, you need to eat the right foods that are nutrient dense. So that's food selection, of course. Then you need the factors like the acid that Dr. Penn was talking about and the other digestive enzymes so that you can break down the foods and absorb them optimally. And then you need a healthy microbiota without dysbiosis so that you are able to digest and absorb the foods. The microbiota helps you digest and assists with absorption as well. And if you can avoid all the things that cause dysbiosis, you won't have the harmful bacteria taking nutrients from you. So that's all very important with regard to energy. In terms of energy and digestion, it's important how you prepare yourself to eat. And again, we get into meal hygiene. Do you have a moment of quiet or silence or gratitude? Or do you pause before you eat so that you get into that parasympathetic mode, as we call it? That will improve digestion and it will improve absorption of your nutrients. And you actually produce more acid and produce more digestive enzymes when you eat that way. Quantity of food is important. It's always said, stop before you feel full. If you do that, you will have more energy after a meal. When you overeat, we know that adversely affects something known as your mitochondria, which are the energy producing components in your cells. We're not going to go into that, but knowing that overeating is a certain way to decrease the energy outcome from a meal. Food is connection. Are you connecting with people you love, with music that you love while you're eating? That will also improve the energy outcome of a meal after you've eaten. And then there's timing, there's chronobiology, circadian biology. When do you eat during the day? There's a lot of good research now showing that if you eat the most food and most of your calories late in the day, especially right before you go to sleep, that will have a detrimental effect on your energy. How often do you eat during the day? It's been shown that for most individuals, not everybody, but most individuals, if you're eating constantly all day, that will be more fatiguing than eating several times a day distinctly and having a pause between that. And we know that there's time-restricted eating patterns. We're not going to go into that here, but if you have, say, at least 12 hours a day where you take in no calories, even 16 is better, the energy outcome of that pattern of eating can be the best yet. So there's a lot of factors to consider in terms of how much energy you get out of the food that you eat. And it goes way beyond what you're eating and just how much you're eating. Dr. Penn, I'll turn it over to you.
I think that's well said, Dr. Luby. I would just summarize then, when you eat, I have patients look at 4 factors then. How you eat, when you eat, what you're eating, and how much you're eating, and choose at least 2 of those factors each time. And when it comes to energy, one point is if you're not doing some time restricted eating, as you've inferred, eating all the time, especially stop eating to eat 3 hours before you go to bed at night, and maybe reducing down the time you're eating to like a 6 or 8 hour window. It's kind of like commuting from Omaha to Lincoln on a Nebraska football game day. It takes forever to get to the game, and you don't get there at kickoff. So it's because you're pounding your mitochondria with all these nutrients coming from your gut into your system and pounding the mitochondria. There's just all these cars coming at them, so to speak, or nutrients. And so they kind of shut down and say, oh, we're going to shut down our energy production here. So, I think that time restricted eating is a very important component, especially if you want to lose weight. Your body's like a hybrid car. You burn carbs, which is the dirty fuel, or you burn ketones or the fat, which is the clean fuel, the electricity. So you want to be able to have a body that has that metabolic switch for optimal health. And I think for optimal energy levels, all the other health style habits are important. Movement becomes very important. If you're a sloth, you get more tired that way. And then finally, there's this concept of hormesis that, and Mark Hyman recently talked about this. What do you do to get energy? Well, he emphasized movement, time restricted eating. And the third thing was hormesis, hot and cold treatment. Now, I'm not sure you're going to be like him and jump in a bathtub with ice in it, or be like the Wim Hof, which we mentioned in our first webinar a few months ago, in terms of hot cold therapy. But the simple thing is, when you're taking a shower, do hot for 5 minutes, cold for a minute, hot for 5 minutes, cold for a minute, hot for 3 minutes, and then cold for a minute. It really wakes you up.
I'd like to second that, Dr. Penn. I've become a cold shower person. Actually, I'm to the point where I can do more cold than hot in my alternating. So I'm working up to that, but I entirely agree with you. That's another way to increase energy. Cold therapy.
That's very interesting. I will not be jumping on that bandwagon right now, but I will work up to it. I will try it, promise.
Yeah, go low and slow. Start with your toes, Rachel.
It's a great suggestion. That concludes the online education. I would like to thank all of our presenters for their experience, knowledge, and expertise. Be sure to subscribe so you're up to date with all of Nebraska Methodist College's continuing education offerings. Thank you.